Cowboys Broken Honor. Madeline Sullivan had promised herself she'd never trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Callahan, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low and knowing. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. The Desert's Cruel Embrace. The relentless sun beat down on Madeline Sullivan's back, each ray a tiny hammer blow against her already aching muscles. The vast expanse of the Arizona desert stretched before her, an undulating ocean of sand and scrub, shimmering under the midday heat. Her throat was parched, a sandpaper dryness that made each swallow a conscious effort. The leather of her reins felt brittle and hot in her hands, a constant reminder of the miles she'd traveled and the miles yet to go. Her horse, Bess, a sturdy mare who had been her faithful companion for years, was showing signs of fatigue, her usually brisk gait reduced to a weary plod. Madeline squinted, her eyes tracing the horizon, searching for any sign of respite, any hint of civilization. But there was nothing, just the endless, unforgiving landscape, a brutal reminder of her own isolation. She'd been a fool to think she could make this journey alone. A fool to believe she could outrun the memories, the pain, the betrayal that had driven her from her home, from everything she had ever known. She had left behind a life of comfort, a sprawling ranch in Texas, a name that carried weight and respect. But it had all been a gilded cage, built on lies and deceit. Her husband, Thomas, a man she had once believed to be the epitome of honor and strength, had proven to be anything but. The discovery of his infidelity, his secret life with another woman, had shattered her world. The wound was still raw, a gaping hole in her heart that seemed to bleed with every breath she took. She had fled, seeking solace in the anonymity of the frontier, hoping to lose herself in the vastness of the West. She wanted to disappear, to become someone else, someone who wasn't burdened by the weight of her past. But the desert, it seemed, was not a place for forgetting. It was a place of reckoning, a crucible where only the strongest survived. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it a swirling cloud of dust and sand. Madeline pulled her bandana up over her nose and mouth, shielding herself from the gritty onslaught. Bess whinnied, shaking her head nervously. The wind seemed to carry a whisper, a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver down Madeline's spine. She wasn't alone. She scanned the horizon again, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw him, a lone rider, silhouetted against the setting sun, approaching from the west. He was still a distance away, but she could sense a dangerous aura about him, a stillness that spoke of a man accustomed to violence. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with a powerful grace, eating up the distance between them. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Madeline's exhaustion. She had been warned about the dangers of the frontier, the outlaws and desperados who roamed these lands, preying on the weak and vulnerable. She had a pistol tucked into her saddlebag, a small, pearl-handled revolver that Thomas had given her years ago, a gift she had never thought she would need. She reached for it now, her hand trembling slightly. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details. He was tall and lean, his body honed to a wiry strength. He wore a battered, wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see the glint of dark eyes, sharp and watchful. A worn leather duster concealed most of his clothing, but she glimpsed the butt of a Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip. He exuded an air of quiet menace, a predator sizing up his prey. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, the stallion snorting and pawing the ground. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Madeline held her breath, her hand tightening around the revolver. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent another shiver down her spine. "Lost, are you?" Madeline swallowed, trying to find her voice. I'm heading to Silver Creek." It was a lie, a desperate attempt to deflect his attention. Silver Creek was miles in the opposite direction. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to pierce through her facade. Silver Creek, huh? That's a long ride from here. And you're headed the wrong way. Madeline's heart sank. He knew she was lying. She cursed her own stupidity. I got turned around. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Turned around? In this desert? That's a good way to end up dead. He dismounted, his movements fluid and effortless. He walked toward her, his spurs clinking softly against the hard, packed ground. Madeline instinctively pulled back, her hand tightening on the revolver. Bess shifted nervously, sensing her fear. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on hers. She could see his face more clearly now, the harsh lines etched by sun and wind, the stubble of a dark beard, the faint scar that ran across his left cheek. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 30s, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of a much longer life, a life filled with hardship and violence. "Name's Rhett Callahan," he said, his voice still low and measured. "And you are?" She hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, whether to reveal her true identity. But she had little choice. She was at his mercy. "Madeline," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Madeline Sullivan." He nodded slowly, his eyes still searching hers. "Sullivan. That's a Texas name, isn't it?" She stiffened. How did he know? I used to live in Texas." "Used to?" He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Running from something, are you Madeline Sullivan?" She flinched, his words hitting too close to the truth. She couldn't meet his gaze, her eyes dropping to the dusty ground. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Don't worry," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I ain't gonna hurt you. But you're in a bad way, and you need help. This desert ain't kind to strangers, especially women traveling alone." Madeline looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the wounds of her past were still too fresh, the memories of Thomas's betrayal too vivid. She had sworn she would never trust a man again. I don't need your help," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Maybe you don't think you do. But you're out of water. Your horse is tired, and you're lost. You won't last another day out here on your own." He was right. She knew it. She was trapped, caught between her fear of him and her fear of the desert. She had no choice. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. I'll accept your help. But just until I get to the next town." He nodded. "Fair enough. We'll ride together for a while. I'm headed north, towards the mountains. There's a small settlement there, a place called Haven. You can rest there, get supplies, and decide what you want to do." Haven. The name sounded like a cruel joke. She was looking for a haven, a place to escape her past, but she doubted she would find it in this desolate land. He turned and walked back to his horse, retrieving a canteen from his saddlebag. He offered it to her. "Drink," he said, slowly. Madeline took the canteen, her hand brushing against his. His skin was warm and rough, calloused from years of hard work and handling weapons. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of compassion. Perhaps that surprised her. She took a small sip of water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She handed the canteen back to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice still weak. He nodded, his eyes still holding hers. "You're scared of me," he murmured, his voice low and knowing. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." He turned from her then, an unspoken something flickering in the air between them. She knew, even then, that there were things worse than the desert's burning heat. Things that lurked in the shadows, things a person carried within. And she knew, too, that she carried her share. Chapter 2. A stranger's shadowed gaze. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange, deep purple, and a bruised, melancholic blue. The desert air, which had been relentlessly hot just hours before, began to cool rapidly, the shift almost violent in its suddenness. Madeline shivered, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. It offered little protection against the encroaching chill, but the gesture itself was comforting, a small act of self-preservation in the face of the overwhelming vastness. Rhett Callahan had built a small fire, the flames crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks and cacti. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent living off the land. He seemed perfectly at ease in this desolate environment, a stark contrast to Madeline's own growing unease. He had offered her some dried meat and hardtack biscuits, a meager meal, but one she accepted gratefully. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of his eyes on her. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a constant, palpable force. She found herself stealing glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was a study in contrasts. The harsh lines etched by time and hardship were softened by the flickering flames, revealing a hint of vulnerability that she hadn't noticed before. His eyes, though dark and often shadowed, held a depth of emotion that she couldn't quite fathom. There was sadness there, and a weariness that mirrored her own, but also a flicker of something else, something that both intrigued and frightened her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. The question had been gnawing at her since they had met. He looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't answer immediately, instead taking a slow sip from his own canteen. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the crackling of the flames and the distant howl of a coyote. "Let's just say I've been where you are," he finally said, his voice low and rough. "Lost and needing a hand." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough to spark a flicker of curiosity in Madeline's heart. She wanted to know more, to understand the story behind his shadowed gaze. But she was also wary, her instincts warning her to keep her distance. "What were you running from?" she asked, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. He chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "Everything," he said. "And nothing." His answer was cryptic, frustratingly vague. She sensed that he was deliberately holding back, shielding himself from her scrutiny. She wondered what secrets he carried, what demons haunted his past. "And haven?" she ventured, changing the subject. "Is it really a haven?" He shrugged. "It's a place. Some folks find peace there. Others, well, they just keep running." He paused, looking intently into the flames. "It's got a sheriff, a surprisingly stubborn old cuss named Brody. Keeps the peace, mostly. There's a saloon, naturally, owned by a woman named Sarah. She makes a mean whiskey, and she's seen more trouble than most men twice her age." Madeline listened, absorbing the details, trying to paint a picture of this place in her mind. It sounded like any other frontier town, a mix of hope and desperation, law and lawlessness. "And what about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Will you stay in Haven?" He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't decided yet." She sensed that he was telling the truth, that he was as adrift as she was, searching for something he couldn't quite name. It was a strange comfort, knowing that she wasn't alone in her uncertainty. The fire began to die down, the flames shrinking, the embers glowing red. The night grew colder, the vastness of the desert pressing in on them. Madeline felt a growing sense of vulnerability, a fear that went beyond the physical dangers of the wilderness. "We should get some sleep," Rhett said, his voice breaking the silence. He gestured towards a small, sheltered area beneath a rocky overhang. "It's not much, but it'll keep the wind off." Madeline nodded, grateful for any protection from the elements. She spread her bedroll on the ground, a thin, worn blanket that offered little comfort. Rhett laid his own bedroll a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. She lay down, her body aching with exhaustion, but her mind was racing. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the quiet strength that emanated from him. She was still afraid of him, but her fear was mixed with a growing sense of curiosity and perhaps even a flicker of trust. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the sounds of the night, the rustling of the wind, the distant cries of animals. But sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts kept returning to Rhett Callahan, to the mystery that surrounded him, to the strange connection she felt with this man she had only just met. She wondered if he was watching her, if he was as aware of her as she was of him. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, if he saw the broken woman she had become, or if he saw something more, something worth saving. She finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with fragmented images of her past, of Thomas's betrayal, of the vast, unforgiving desert, and of the shadowed gaze of the stranger who had offered her a helping hand. She dreamt he stood over her, a silhouette against the fading moon, his hand outstretched, not in threat, but in an offer. An offer of what? She did not know, and she awoke with a start, the cold air biting at her exposed skin, and the memory of his eyes, dark and deep, still lingering in her mind. The fire was nothing but ash, and he was gone. A small, folded piece of paper lay where his bedroll had been. Chapter 3. Whispers of a Forgotten Past. Madeline unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rough, almost crude, but legible. Gone to scout. Be back by midday. Stay put. The note was unsigned, but she knew it was from Rhett. A wave of relief washed over her, followed by a surge of annoyance. He hadn't even bothered to wake her. She crumpled the paper in her fist, then smoothed it out again, her eyes lingering on the words. Stay put. As if she had any other choice. She was still stranded, still reliant on his goodwill, his knowledge of this unforgiving land. She looked around the small campsite, taking in the remnants of their meager fire, the imprints of their bedrolls on the dusty ground. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting among the rocks. The vastness of the desert seemed to press in on her, amplifying her sense of isolation. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, and walked to the edge of the rocky overhang. The sun was already climbing in the sky, its rays casting long shadows across the sand. The landscape was breathtaking in its stark beauty, but it also held a sense of menace, a reminder of her vulnerability. She decided to explore the immediate area, hoping to find some distraction from her anxious thoughts. She walked carefully, mindful of the uneven terrain, the hidden dangers that might lurk beneath the surface. She found a small spring, a trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rocks, surrounded by a patch of surprisingly green vegetation. It was a reminder that even in the harshest environments, life could find a way to flourish. She knelt beside the spring, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. The water was cool and refreshing, a welcome relief from the dryness in her throat. She splashed some on her face, washing away the dust and grime of the previous day. As she sat there, her thoughts drifted back to her past, to the life she had left behind. She remembered the sprawling ranch house, the manicured lawns, the bustling activity of the ranch hands. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a world away from this desolate wilderness. She had grown up on that ranch, surrounded by love and privilege. Her father, a stern but kind man, had taught her to ride and shoot, to be independent and resourceful. He had always encouraged her to follow her dreams, to be true to herself. But he had also instilled in her a strong sense of duty, a belief in the importance of family and tradition. She had met Thomas at a local dance, a handsome, charming man who had swept her off her feet. He had seemed like the perfect match, a man who shared her values, her love of the land. She had believed in him, trusted him completely. The betrayal had been a devastating blow, shattering her illusions, leaving her feeling lost and adrift. She had thought she knew him, thought she knew herself. But the discovery of his secret life had revealed a darkness she had never imagined, a side of him she had never seen. She had tried to confront him, to understand why he had done it. But he had refused to talk, to offer any explanation. He had simply turned away, his silence more damning than any words could have been. She had realized then that her marriage was a sham, a carefully constructed facade that had crumbled at the first sign of truth. She had no choice but to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of his betrayal. She had packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, and had ridden away in the dead of night, leaving behind everything she had ever known. She had no plan, no destination, only a desperate need to escape, to find some semblance of peace. A sound startled her, pulling her back to the present. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. Ro was standing there, watching her, his expression unreadable. He had returned, silently, as if he had materialized from the desert itself. "You're back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his eyes scanning her face. "I told you I'd be back. I didn't know if I could trust you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. He didn't reply, his gaze holding hers. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. "I found a spring," she said, changing the subject, trying to regain her composure. He followed her gaze towards the small patch of green. "Good," he said. "We'll need water." He dismounted, his movements fluid and effortless. He walked towards the spring, kneeling beside it and taking a long drink. He then refilled his canteen and offered it to her. She took it, their hands brushing briefly. She noticed the calluses on his fingers, the scars that marked his skin. They were the marks of a hard life, a life lived on the edge. "We should get moving," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "We're still a long way from Haven." He didn't offer any explanation for his early morning absence, and she didn't ask. There were walls built up between them, barriers of mistrust and unspoken secrets. But as she looked at his strong profile, the way the sunlight caught the glint of silver in his dark hair, she knew the walls were, perhaps, starting to crumble. Just a little. The desert whispered secrets, but so did the past. And both, she sensed, were about to catch up with them. Chapter 4. The Weight of Broken Vows. They rode in silence for most of the morning, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape began to change, the flat, open desert giving way to rolling hills and rocky canyons. The vegetation became more sparse, the trees stunted and twisted by the harsh winds. Madeline found herself constantly glancing at Rhett, studying his profile, trying to decipher the man beneath the stoic exterior. He rode with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect harmony with his horse. He seemed utterly at home in this wild, unforgiving land, a stark contrast to her own sense of displacement. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him, the wounds that had left their mark on his soul. She sensed a deep sadness within him, a weariness that resonated with her own. But she also sensed a strength, a resilience that she admired. "How did you end up out here?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. She needed to know more, to understand the forces that had driven him to this solitary existence. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, deciding how much to reveal. "I had a life, once," he finally said, his voice low and raspy. "A wife. A ranch. Just like you." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. He had known about her past, about her life in Texas. But how? What happened? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "She died," he said. "Cholera. Took her quick. I couldn't save her." Madeline felt a surge of empathy for him, a shared understanding of the devastating power of loss. She knew what it was like to lose someone you loved, to have your world shattered in an instant. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "It was a long time ago," he said. "But some wounds they never fully heal." They rode in silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief hanging heavy in the air. Madeline felt a strange connection to him, a bond forged by their mutual experiences of loss and betrayal. "What about your ranch?" she asked, wanting to know more, to understand how he had ended up so alone. "Sold it," he said. "Couldn't bear to stay there without her. Too many memories." He paused, then added, with a hint of bitterness, "Besides, there were debts. Complications." She sensed that there was more to the story, that he was holding back, protecting himself from further pain. She didn't press him, knowing that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. "So you just wandered?" she asked. He shrugged. "For a while. Took odd jobs. Gun for hire, mostly." Madeline's heart sank. She had suspected as much. He was a dangerous man, a man who had lived by violence. But she also sensed that he wasn't inherently cruel, that he had been forced into this life by circumstances beyond his control. "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm just trying to find some peace," he said. "A place to settle down, maybe. Start over." His words echoed her own desires, her own longing for a new beginning. She wondered if Haven could offer them both the redemption they sought. As they rode deeper into the canyons, the landscape became more treacherous. The trail narrowed, winding along steep cliffs and rocky ledges. Madeline felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger. Suddenly, Rhett reined in his horse, his body tensing. He raised his hand, signaling her to stop. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with alarm. He didn't answer, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. He seemed to be listening for something, his senses on high alert. "Riders," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Up ahead. And they ain't friendly." Madeline's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for the revolver in her saddlebag, her hand trembling. She had never fired a gun at another person, and the thought terrified her. "What do we do?" she asked. "We ride," he said. "Fast. And we pray they don't catch us." He spurred his horse forward, his stallion leaping into a gallop. Madeline followed close behind, Bess struggling to keep up. The wind whipped through her hair, stinging her eyes. She could hear the pounding of hooves behind them, the shouts of their pursuers. She glanced back, her heart sinking. There were at least a dozen riders, heavily armed, closing in fast. They were outlaws, she knew, the kind of men who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. She looked at Rhett, his face grim and determined. He was a skilled rider, a seasoned fighter. But even he couldn't fight off that many men alone. She realized then that they were trapped, caught between the unforgiving landscape and the ruthless outlaws. Her broken vows seemed a distant memory, a luxury she couldn't afford. It was about survival now, and her own past and future were catching up, a storm of dust and blood and regret on the horizon. The weight of her past, the weight of his, it all pressed down, and the only way out was forward. Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of silent stars. They rode hard, pushing their horses to their limits, the rugged terrain a blur beneath them. Madeline clung to Bess's mane, her body jolting with every stride, her muscles screaming in protest. She could hear the outlaws gaining on them, their shouts and curses growing louder, closer. Rhett glanced back, his face grim. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The horses were tiring, and the outlaws were relentless. He veered off the main trail, heading towards a narrow, rocky gorge. Madeline followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what his plan was, but she trusted him, her instincts telling her that he was their only hope. The gorge was treacherous, the path narrow and winding, littered with loose rocks and steep drop-offs. Bess stumbled several times, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Madeline held on tight, her knuckles white, her body tense with fear. Rhett led them deeper into the gorge, the walls rising high on either side, casting long, dark shadows. The sounds of their pursuers faded slightly, muffled by the rocks and the wind. He finally slowed his horse to a walk, allowing Bess to catch her breath. He dismounted, his movements cautious and alert. He scanned the surrounding cliffs, his eyes searching for any sign of danger. "We'll make a stand here," he said, his voice low and firm. "It's our best chance." Madeline dismounted, her legs trembling. She looked around the gorge, her heart sinking. It was a natural fortress, but it was also a trap. There was no way out, except the way they had come. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. He nodded. "It's better than being caught in the open. We have the advantage of height, and the narrow passage will make it difficult for them to attack us all at once." He began gathering rocks, piling them up to create a makeshift barricade. Madeline helped him, her hands raw and bleeding. She worked quickly, efficiently, her fear fueling her movements. They finished the barricade just as the first of the outlaws appeared at the entrance to the gorge. They were a rough-looking bunch, heavily armed and clearly spoiling for a fight. Well, one of them sneered, a tall, lanky man with a cruel scar across his face. Looks like we got ourselves a couple of trapped rabbits. Rhett didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the outlaw leader. He drew his Colt peacemaker, his movements calm and deliberate. You can still walk away from this, Rhett said, his voice carrying across the narrow space. Just turn around and ride. The outlaw leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. And miss out on all the fun? I don't think so. We've been tracking you for days, Callahan. You got something that belongs to us. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. They knew Rhett. They were after him, not her. She felt a surge of relief, mixed with a growing sense of dread. I don't know what you're talking about, Rhett said, his voice steady. Don't play dumb with me, the outlaw leader snarled. We know you took the gold, and we're here to get it back. Gold. So that was it. Rhett was a thief, a wanted man. Madeline felt a wave of disappointment, a sense of betrayal. She had started to trust him, to believe in him. But he was just another outlaw, another liar. The outlaws opened fire. Their bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. Rhett returned fire, his shots accurate and deadly. Madeline ducked behind the barricade, her body trembling. She had never been in a gunfight before, and the experience was terrifying. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded. Madeline huddled behind the rocks, her eyes squeezed shut, praying for it to be over. She peeked over the barricade, her heart pounding in her chest. Rhett was still fighting, his face grim and determined. He was a skilled gunman, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. She saw one of the outlaws sneaking around the side, trying to flank them. He was aiming his rifle at Rhett's back. Madeline reacted instinctively. She grabbed her revolver, her hand trembling, and fired. The shot went wild, missing the outlaw, but it alerted Rhett to the danger. He spun around, firing his own gun, hitting the outlaw squarely in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, dead. Rhett looked at Madeline, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of her help. The tide of the battle began to turn. Rhett's marksmanship, combined with the defensive advantage of the gorge, proved too much for the outlaws. They began to retreat, their numbers dwindling. Finally, the last of the outlaws fled, leaving behind a scene of carnage and destruction. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Rhett lowered his gun, his body slumping with exhaustion. He looked at Madeline, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. You saved my life, he said, his voice hoarse. Madeline shook her head. You saved mine, too. They stared at each other, the weight of what they had just been through hanging heavy between them. They had faced death together, and they had survived. The sun had set, and the desert was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The stars began to appear, twinkling in the vast, dark sky. They built a fire, its light a fragile promise of warmth. There were truths yet to be spoken, a reckoning of sorts. He had lied, and she had shot a man. Beneath the silent stars, their fragile alliance had just begun. Chapter 6. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls, illuminating the exhausted faces of Madeline and Rhett. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in their ears. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust, a grim reminder of the violence they had just survived. Madeline sat huddled by the fire, her body aching, her mind reeling. She had killed a man. The image of the outlaw falling, his eyes wide with surprise and pain, was seared into her memory. She had never taken a life before, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. Rhett sat across from her, cleaning his Colt, his movements methodical and practiced. He seemed unfazed by the bloodshed, accustomed to the violence that had become a part of his life. But Madeline could see the weariness in his eyes, the the subtle slump of his shoulders, the unspoken regret that haunted his gaze. "They were after you," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Because of the gold." He didn't look up, his focus remaining on his gun. "Yes," he said, his voice low and flat. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disappointment. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of pain in his gaze, a hint of vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. "I didn't lie," he said. "I just didn't tell you the whole truth." "That's the same thing," she retorted. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he said. "More complicated than you know." "Try me," she challenged, her voice rising. She needed to understand, to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. He hesitated, then began to speak, his voice slow and measured. "The gold, it belonged to a mining company. A corrupt one. They were cheating their workers, stealing their wages, treating them like slaves. I was hired to recover what was rightfully theirs." Madeline stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile this new information with the image of him as an outlaw, a thief. "You were stealing from thieves?" she asked, her voice incredulous. He nodded. "It wasn't legal, I know, but it was just. Those men had families to feed, lives to live. They deserved what they had earned." "And the men who came after you?" she asked. "Who were they?" "Hired guns," he said. "Mercenaries paid by the mining company to get the gold back. They wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way." Madeline felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had judged him too quickly, too harshly. She had assumed the worst, based on her own past experiences, her own ingrained mistrust of men. "I am sorry," she said, her voice softening. "I didn't understand." He shrugged. "You had no reason to trust me," he said. "I'm a stranger, a man with a gun and a past." They fell silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Madeline thought about her own past, about the betrayal she had suffered, the pain she had endured. She had let her past define her, had allowed it to shape her perceptions of the world. "I ran away, too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "From a husband who lied, who betrayed me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with empathy. "We all carry our burdens, Madeline," he said. "Our scars. It's what we do with them that matters." His words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within her soul. She had been running from her pain, trying to escape her past. But she realized now that she couldn't outrun it. She had to face it, to confront it, to learn from it. "I don't want to run anymore," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to find my own way, to build a new life." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Haven might be the place for that," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's a fresh start. A place where people can reinvent themselves." He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "We should get some rest," he said. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." Madeline nodded, her body exhausted, but her mind strangely at peace. She had faced death today, and she had survived. She had learned a valuable lesson about trust, about judgment, about the complexities of human nature. She unrolled her bedroll and noticed for the first time that Rhett had shielded her sleeping place with extra rocks, that his bedroll was closer, subtly protecting. These small acts, and the echoes of the gunfight and the revelations that followed, whispered of something more, a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of violence and shared vulnerability. The regret lingered, but so did a flicker of hope, a faint glimmer of light in the vast darkness of the desert night. Chapter 7. The Price of Trust and Survival. The journey to Haven was arduous, a test of endurance and resilience. The landscape remained harsh and unforgiving, the sun beating down relentlessly, the wind whipping sand and dust into their faces. They rationed their water carefully, sharing the last of their meager supplies. Madeline found herself relying on Rhett more and more. He was her guide, her protector, her only companion in this desolate wilderness. He knew how to navigate the treacherous terrain, how to find water and shelter, how to survive. She watched him closely, observing his every move, learning from his quiet strength, his resourcefulness. She began to see him not just as a gunfighter, a man with a dangerous past, but as a human being, flawed and vulnerable, yet capable of kindness and compassion. He, in turn, seemed to be more open with her, sharing small details about his life, his past. He told her about his wife, Sarah, about their dreams of building a life together, about the heartbreak of her loss. He spoke of his regrets, his mistakes, his desire for redemption. Madeline listened, her heart aching for him, her own wounds resonating with his. She shared her own story, her own pain, her own longing for a new beginning. They found solace in their shared experiences, a bond forged by their mutual vulnerability. But the journey was not without its challenges. They encountered more dangers, more threats. They were tracked by a group of Native Americans, wary of outsiders encroaching on their territory. Rhett, using a combination of diplomacy and firmness, managed to negotiate a peaceful passage, offering them supplies and respect. They were caught in a sudden sandstorm, a blinding, suffocating whirlwind of dust and sand. Rhett shielded Madeline with his body, protecting her from the worst of the storm. They huddled together, their faces pressed close, waiting for the storm to pass. They faced hunger, thirst, exhaustion. But they persevered, their determination fueled by their shared desire to reach haven, to find a place of refuge, a place to start anew. One evening, as they were setting up camp, Madeline noticed a change in Rhett's demeanor. He seemed preoccupied, distant, his eyes scanning the horizon nervously. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He hesitated, then said, "I think we're being followed." Madeline's heart sank. She had hoped they had left the dangers behind them, that they were finally safe. "By who?" she asked. "The mining company?" He shook his head. "No. Someone else. Someone worse." He didn't elaborate, but Madeline could sense the fear in his eyes, the unspoken dread that hung heavy in the air. She knew that whatever was out there, it was a serious threat, a danger that could destroy their fragile hopes of a new beginning. They continued their journey, their pace quickening, their senses on high alert. They rode through the night, guided by the stars, their horses weary but determined. As dawn approached, they finally saw it. Haven, a small, dusty town nestled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills and towering mountains. It looked like any other frontier town, a collection of ramshackle buildings, a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office. But to Madeline and Rhett, it represented something more. It was a symbol of hope, a promise of refuge, a chance for a new beginning. They rode into town, their arrival met with curious stares from the townsfolk. They were strangers, outsiders, and their presence was immediately noted. Rhett led them to the sheriff's office, a small, dilapidated building with a faded sign hanging above the door. He dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "Wait here," he said to Madeline. "I need to talk to the sheriff." Madeline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, what dangers might await them in this new town. The price of survival was clear. Constant vigilance. And the price of trust? That was still being calculated, tallied in the wary glances of the townsfolk, in Rhett's guarded posture, in the very air that crackled with the unspoken question, would Haven be their salvation or their final stand? Chapter 8. Scars that time cannot erase. Rhett stepped into the sheriff's office, the dim interior a stark contrast to the bright sunlight outside. The air smelled of stale tobacco and old wood, a familiar scent that brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. A man sat behind a cluttered desk, his feet propped up, his hat tilted low over his eyes. He was an older man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes sharp and piercing. He wore a tarnished badge on his chest, the symbol of his authority. This had to be Brody. "Can I help you?" the sheriff asked, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. He didn't bother to remove his feet from the desk. Rhett removed his hat, a gesture of respect. "Name's Rhett Callahan," he said. "This town called Haven?" The sheriff eyed him suspiciously. "It is. And you are?" "Just passing through," Rhett said. "Looking for a place to rest, Maybe find some work. The sheriff grunted. We get a lot of drifters through here, he said. Most of 'em are trouble. I ain't looking for trouble, Rhett said, his voice firm. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. I've seen you before, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. Somewhere Rhett's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped to remain anonymous, to blend in with the other newcomers. But the sheriff's memory was clearly better than he had anticipated. I don't think so, Rhett said, trying to sound casual. The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Rhett's face. You're Callahan, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The one they call the Shadow Rider. The one who stole the gold from the Blue Creek Mining Company. Rhett knew he was cornered. He couldn't deny it any longer. That gold belonged to the miners, he said, his voice defiant. They were being cheated, robbed. The sheriff chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. That ain't your concern, he said. The law is the law. And you broke it. Sometimes the law ain't just, Rhett retorted. The sheriff stood up, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. You're under arrest, Callahan, he said. Rhett didn't move. He knew he could draw his gun, try to fight his way out. But he was tired of running, tired of fighting. He wanted peace, a chance to start over. I ain't going to jail, he said, his voice steady. Not for something I believe was right. The sheriff smiled, a cruel, knowing smile.
You don't have a choice, he said.
Unless you want to die here, in this dusty little town. Suddenly, the door to the sheriff's office burst open, and Madeline stepped inside, her revolver drawn and aimed at the sheriff. Let him go, she said, her voice trembling but firm. The sheriff's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated her intervention. Whoa there, little lady, he said, trying to sound calm. You don't want to do something you'll regret. I already regret a lot of things, Madeline said, her voice filled with emotion. But I won't regret standing up for what's right. And I won't let you take him. Rhett looked at Madeline, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. She had risked her own life to save him, a woman he had only recently met, a woman he had initially mistrusted. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flickering between Madeline and Rhett. He knew he was outgunned, outmaneuvered. He slowly lowered his hand, his gun still holstered. All right, he said, his voice grudging. You can go. But don't think this is over, Callahan. I'll be watching you. And if you step out of line, I'll be there to take you down. Rhett nodded.
Fair enough, he said.
He walked towards Madeline, his eyes meeting hers. There was a silent understanding between them, a bond forged by their shared experiences, their mutual respect. They stepped out of the sheriff's office, back into the bright sunlight. The townsfolk watched them, their faces curious and apprehensive. Madeline lowered her gun, her hand still trembling. She looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. Why did you do that? He asked, his voice filled with wonder. Because I believe in you, she said. And because I'm not afraid anymore. The scars of their pasts, the physical and emotional ones, were still there, a constant reminder of the pain they had endured. But as they stood there, together, facing the uncertain future, they knew that they were stronger together, that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The scars remained, but so did hope, a fragile, precious thing, blooming in the heart of Haven. Chapter 9. A dance of fear and desire. Haven, despite its name, was a town simmering with undercurrents of tension. The wary glances of the townsfolk, the ever-present threat of the sheriff, and the knowledge that Rhett was a wanted man created a constant sense of unease. Yet, amidst this precarious atmosphere, Madeline and Rhett found themselves drawn to each other, their connection deepening with each passing day. They found lodging in a small, sparsely furnished room above the general store, the thin walls offering little privacy. They shared their meals, their stories, their fears. They learned to read each other's silences, to understand the unspoken emotions that flickered in their eyes. Rhett found work at the local livery stable, his skill with horses quickly earning him the respect of the owner, a gruff but kind man named Silas. Madeline helped out at the general store, her quick wit and organizational skills proving invaluable to the owner, a harried woman named Martha. They tried to blend in, to become a part of the community, but they were always aware of being outsiders, of being watched. The sheriff, Brody, made his presence known, his constant surveillance a reminder of Rhett's precarious situation. One evening, as Madeline and Rhett were walking back to their room after a long day's work, they encountered Sarah, the owner of the saloon. She was a striking woman, her age indeterminate, her eyes filled with a knowing wisdom. "You two seem to be settling in," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "Trying to," Rhett replied, his voice guarded. Sarah smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to penetrate their facades. "Haven can be a good place," she said, "but it can also be dangerous, especially for those who carry secrets." Madeline felt a shiver run down her spine. Sarah's words seemed to carry a hidden warning, a subtle threat. "We all have secrets," Madeline said, her voice defensive. Sarah nodded. "Indeed," she said. "But some secrets are more dangerous than others." She looked at Rhett, her eyes lingering on his face. "You're a good man, Callahan," she said, "despite what some might say. But you need to be careful. There are forces at play here that you don't understand." She turned and walked away, leaving Madeline and Rhett standing there, their hearts filled with unease. That night, as they lay in their separate beds, the thin walls separating them seeming inadequate to contain the emotions that swirled between them, Madeline couldn't sleep. She was acutely aware of Rhett's presence, of his quiet breathing, of the strength that emanated from him. She was drawn to him, attracted to his resilience, his quiet courage, his vulnerability. But she was also afraid of opening her heart again, of risking another betrayal. She got out of bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit town. The saloon was still open, its lights spilling out onto the dusty street, the sounds of music and laughter drifting through the night air. She saw Rhett standing outside the saloon, talking to Sarah. They were standing close together, their heads bent in conversation. Madeline felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, unfamiliar emotion. She watched them for a long moment, her heart aching. She didn't know what they were talking about, but she sensed that it was important, that it concerned her. Rhett finally turned and walked away, heading back towards their room. Madeline quickly returned to her bed, pretending to be asleep. He entered the room quietly, his movements careful not to disturb her. She could feel his eyes on her, his gaze lingering on her face. He lay down on his bed, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Madeline's heart was pounding in her chest, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and desire. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to tell him how she felt. But she was afraid of rejection, afraid of vulnerability. The dance of fear and desire continued, a delicate ballet of unspoken emotions, of hesitant gestures, of longing glances. They were drawn to each other, pulled by an invisible force, but they were also held back by their pasts, their fears, their uncertainties. It was a push and pull, a delicate balance between the yearning for connection and the instinct for self-preservation. The night held its breath, and in the quiet room above the general store, two hearts beat as one, afraid and hopeful, all at once. Chapter 10. The Unforgiving Heart of the Frontier. The following days settled into a fragile routine. Rhett worked at the livery, his quiet competence earning him Silas's grudging respect. Madeline continued to assist Martha at the general store, her efficiency and organizational skills proving invaluable. They were slowly integrating into Haven's community, but the underlying tension remained, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Sheriff Brody continued his watchful surveillance, his presence a looming shadow over their lives. He seemed to be waiting for Rhett to make a mistake, to give him an excuse to act. The townsfolk, while polite, remained wary, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One afternoon, a stagecoach arrived in Haven, bringing with it a wave of excitement and a sense of unease. Stagecoaches meant news, supplies, and sometimes trouble. This one brought a man who seemed to embody all three. He was tall, well-dressed, and exuded an air of authority and wealth. He introduced himself as Mr. Thornton, a representative of the Blue Creek Mining Company. He claimed he was in Haven on business, but his eyes, cold and calculating, suggested a more sinister purpose. Madeline, working at the general store, overheard snippets of conversation between Thornton and some of the townsfolk. He was asking about Rhett, inquiring about his whereabouts, his activities. He was offering a reward for information, a substantial sum that would tempt even the most loyal of citizens. She felt a surge of fear, a sense of impending doom. She knew that Thornton's arrival was not a coincidence, that he was there to reclaim the stolen gold, to bring Rhett to justice, or worse. She rushed to the livery stable, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Rhett tending to a horse, his back to her. "Rhett," she said, her voice urgent. "We have a problem." He turned, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the fear in her face, the urgency in her posture. "What is it?" he asked. She quickly explained about Thornton's arrival, about his inquiries, about the reward. Rhett listened, his face growing grim. "He won't give up," he said, his voice low and resigned. "He'll keep hunting me until he gets what he wants." "We have to leave," Madeline said. "We have to get out of Haven." Rhett shook his head. "Running won't solve anything," he said. "He'll just keep chasing us. And I'm tired of running. But what else can we do?" she asked, her voice desperate. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sadness. "We fight," he said. "We stand our ground. We protect what's ours." Madeline knew that he was right. Running was not an option. They had to face their enemies, to confront the dangers that threatened their fragile hopes of a new beginning. That evening, as they were walking back to their room, they were confronted by Sheriff Brody, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Callahan," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "I've been hearing things." "About you." "About the gold. About a man named Thornton." Rhett didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "I'm giving you a choice," Brody said. "You can turn yourself in, hand over the gold, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial. Or you can resist and face the consequences." Madeline felt a surge of anger. The sheriff was corrupt, she knew, in league with Thornton and the mining company. He was not interested in justice, only in lining his own pockets. "A fair trial with you in this town?" Rhett asked with open sarcasm, stepping forward. "You have my word," Brody began, but his eyes betrayed him. Before Brody could finish or reach for his weapon, two men stepped out from the shadows, guns drawn. They were Thornton's men, hired guns, their faces hardened and ruthless. "Looks like you won't have to make that choice after all, Callahan," Thornton said, stepping out from behind them, a smug smile on his face. "You're coming with me, dead or alive." The unforgiving heart of the frontier had caught up with them. The fragile peace of Haven was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of greed, betrayal, and violence. There, in the dusty street, surrounded by enemies, Madeline and Rhett prepared for the fight of their lives. Their choices and their very survival hinged on the next few desperate moments. Chapter 11. Between the Law and the Lawless. The standoff in the dusty street was a tableau of tension, a moment frozen in time. Madeline, Rhett, Sheriff Brody, Thornton, and the two hired guns all locked in a silent, deadly dance. The air crackled with unspoken threats, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed, Callahan," Thornton said, his voice smooth and oily. "Just give me the gold, and you can walk away." "The gold belongs to the miners," Rhett replied, his voice firm and unwavering. "You'll never get it." Thornton sighed dramatically. "Such a pity," he said. "I had hoped we could avoid this. But you leave me no choice." He nodded to his men, and they raised their guns, ready to fire. Madeline instinctively stepped in front of Rhett, shielding him with her body. "Don't," she cried. "He's unarmed." It was a lie, of course. Rhett always carried a hidden weapon, but she hoped to buy them some time, some advantage. Thornton laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You think I'm a fool, woman?" he said. Callahan is never unarmed. Before anyone could react, Rhett moved with lightning speed. He drew a small Derringer pistol from his boot, firing 2 quick shots. One of the hired guns crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering on the dusty street. The other gunman, momentarily stunned, hesitated. Rhett used the distraction to his advantage. He tackled the remaining gunman, wrestling him to the ground. They grappled for the gun, their bodies struggling in the dirt. Madeline, seeing her chance, ran towards the fallen gun. She picked it up, her hand trembling, and pointed it at Thornton. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice surprisingly steady. Thornton, his eyes wide with surprise and fear, froze. He hadn't expected this resistance, this defiance. Sheriff Brody, who had remained strangely passive during the initial confrontation, finally seemed to come to his senses. He drew his own gun, but he didn't point it at Rhett or Madeline. He pointed it at Thornton. "That's enough," Brody said, his voice surprisingly firm. "This has gone too far." Thornton stared at Brody, his face contorted with rage. "You're siding with them?"
He spat.
"You're a lawman, sworn to uphold the law." "I'm sworn to uphold justice," Brody corrected, his voice unwavering. "And what you're doing here ain't just. You're a bully, Thornton, and I won't stand for it." Rhett, having disarmed his opponent, stood up, his chest heaving. He looked at Brody, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. The remaining gunman, seeing that he was outnumbered, surrendered, dropping his weapon to the ground. The tension slowly dissipated, the immediate threat neutralized. The standoff was over, but the underlying conflict remained. Thornton, his face red with fury, glared at Brody. "You'll regret this, Sheriff," he said. "You've made a powerful enemy." "I've faced worse," Brody replied, his voice calm. Thornton, realizing that he had lost, turned and stalked away, his defeated henchman following close behind. Brody turned to Rhett, his expression unreadable. "I could still arrest you, Callahan," he said. "For the gold, for resisting arrest." "But you won't," Rhett said, his voice confident. Brody sighed. "No," he said. "I won't. You saved my life, and you stood up to Thornton. That counts for something." He paused, then added, "But don't think this means you're free to do as you please. I'm still watching you. And if you break the law again, I'll bring you in." Rhett nodded.
"Fair enough," he said.
Brody turned to Madeline, his eyes softening slightly. "You're a brave woman, Miss Sullivan," he said. "You stood your ground, even when faced with danger." Madeline smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We all have to do what we believe is right," she said. The law and the lawless had clashed, and for a brief moment, the lines had blurred. Justice, it seemed, had prevailed, not through the rigid application of the law, but through the courage and conviction of individuals willing to stand up for what they believed in. The uneasy truce held, but the future remained uncertain, hanging in the balance between the forces of greed and the fragile hope for a better life. Chapter 12. Secrets Buried in the Sand. The aftermath of the confrontation with Thornton and his men left Haven in a state of quiet unease. The townsfolk, while relieved that violence had been averted, were also wary, aware that the underlying tensions remained. Sheriff Brody, having taken a stand against Thornton, seemed to have earned a grudging respect from both the community and Rhett, but the situation was far from resolved. Rhett and Madeline returned to their room above the general store, the events of the day weighing heavily on their minds. They had survived another challenge, but they knew that Thornton would not give up easily. He was a powerful man, with resources and connections, and he would undoubtedly seek revenge. "What do we do now?" Madeline asked, her voice filled with concern. Rhett sat on the edge of his bed, his face etched with worry. "I don't know," he admitted. "We can't stay here, not with Thornton still out there. But we can't run either. He'll just keep chasing us." They fell silent, their thoughts consumed by their precarious situation. They were trapped, caught between a powerful enemy and a town that offered only a fragile sanctuary. Madeline, seeking a distraction from her anxious thoughts, began to tidy up the room. She noticed a loose floorboard beneath Rhett's bed, something she hadn't noticed before. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down and examined it more closely. She lifted the floorboard, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal and a small, locked wooden box. "Rhett," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "Look at this." He joined her, kneeling beside her and examining the contents of the hidden compartment. He recognized the journal immediately. "That's Sarah's," he said, referring to his deceased wife. "I thought I had lost it." He carefully opened the journal, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. The pages were filled with Sarah's thoughts, her dreams, her fears, her love for Rhett. He read a few passages aloud, his voice choked with emotion. Madeline watched him, her heart aching for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the love that still burned brightly for his lost wife. They then turned their attention to the wooden box. It was small, intricately carved, and secured with a sturdy lock. Rhett tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Do you know what's inside?" Madeline asked. Rhett shook his head. "No," he said. "Sarah never told me about this box. I didn't even know it existed." They spent the next hour trying to open the box, but their efforts were in vain. The lock was too strong, too intricate. Finally, Rhett had an idea. He remembered that Silas, the owner of the livery stable, was a skilled blacksmith, known for his ability to craft and repair all sorts of metal objects. "Silas might be able to open it," he said. "He's good with locks." They decided to take the box to Silas the next morning, hoping that he could help them unlock its secrets. As they lay in their separate beds that night, the journal and the locked box lay between them, tangible symbols of the past, of secrets yet to be revealed. Madeline couldn't shake the feeling that the contents of the box held the key to their future, that it would somehow change their lives forever. She thought about Sarah, Rhett's deceased wife, and the journal she had left behind. She wondered what secrets it held, what clues it might offer about Rhett's past, about the forces that had shaped him into the man he was. The secrets buried in the sand, both literal and metaphorical, were beginning to surface. The journal and the box were whispers from the past, and Madeline knew that listening to them was the only way to navigate the uncertain future. The answers, she suspected, were more complex and intertwined than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 13. The Bitter Taste of Betrayal. The next morning, Rhett and Madeline took the locked wooden box to Silas at the livery stable. Silas, a gruff but kind-hearted man, examined the box carefully, his experienced eyes assessing the intricate lock mechanism. "This is a fine piece of work," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Not something you see every day. The lock is complex, but I think I can open it. It'll take some time, though." "Take all the time you need," Rhett said. "We're in no hurry." Silas set to work, his skilled hands manipulating a variety of tools, his brow furrowed in concentration. He worked in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic tapping of his hammer and the occasional grunt of effort. Madeline and Rhett watched him, their anticipation growing with each passing moment. They were eager to discover the contents of the box, to unlock the secrets it held. While they waited, Rhett decided to read more of Sarah's journal. He found a passage that caught his attention, a passage that seemed to hint at a hidden danger, a betrayal that Sarah had uncovered. "Listen to this," he said to Madeline, his voice filled with concern. "I fear there is treachery afoot, a darkness that threatens to consume us all. The one we trust, the one we believe to be our friend, is not who he seems. He hides behind a mask of loyalty, but his heart is filled with greed and deceit." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. Sarah's words were ominous, filled with a sense of impending doom. "Who do you think she was talking about?" Madeline asked. Rhett shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But it sounds like someone close to us, someone we trusted." They pondered Sarah's words, trying to decipher their meaning, to identify the person she was referring to. Could it be Sheriff Brody? He had seemed to turn over a new leaf, but perhaps it was all an act, a carefully constructed facade. Or could it be someone else, someone they had overlooked, someone hiding in plain sight? After several hours of painstaking work, Silas finally managed to open the lock. He carefully lifted the lid of the wooden box, revealing its contents. Inside, they found a collection of documents, neatly organized and tied together with a ribbon. There were letters, deeds, contracts, and a map. Rhett and Madeline began to examine the documents, their eyes scanning the faded ink, their minds racing to make sense of the information. They soon realized that the documents revealed a conspiracy, a plot to defraud the miners of the Blue Creek Mining Company of their rightful claims. The documents implicated not only Thornton, but also several prominent figures in Haven, including, shockingly, Sheriff Brody. The betrayal was deeper, more far-reaching than they had imagined. Brody, the man who had seemed to stand up to Thornton, was in fact his accomplice, a corrupt lawman who had been profiting from the miners' misery. The map detailed the hidden location where the stolen gold was kept. Madeline felt a wave of nausea, a bitter taste of betrayal. She had trusted Brody, had believed in his apparent change of heart. But he was just another liar, another deceiver. Rhett slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with rage.
I should have known, he said.
I should have seen through his act. It's not your fault, Madeline said, trying to comfort him. He fooled us all. They now had proof of Brody's corruption, evidence that could expose his crimes and bring him to justice. But they also knew that revealing this information would be dangerous. Chapter 14. A reckoning under the blazing sun. The discovery of Brody's betrayal changed everything. Rhett and Madeline knew they couldn't simply hand the evidence over to the authorities. The sheriff was the authority in Haven. They were on their own, facing a corrupt lawman and a powerful mining company, all while trying to protect the miners' stolen gold. We need to get this information to someone who can do something about it, Madeline said, her mind racing. Someone outside of Haven. Someone Brody can't control. Rhett nodded. There's a judge, Judge Thompson, in Silver Gulch, he said. He's known for being fair, incorruptible. If we can get these documents to him, he'll see that justice is done. Silver Gulch was a 2-day ride from Haven, a dangerous journey through open country where they would be vulnerable to Thornton's men and Brody's pursuit. But they had no other choice. They decided to leave Haven under the cover of darkness, hoping to avoid detection. They packed their meager belongings, gathered their supplies, and prepared their horses. Silas, having learned of Brody's treachery, offered his assistance. He provided them with fresh horses, sturdy saddles, and enough provisions to last them for several days. Be careful. You too, he said, his voice filled with concern. Brody is a dangerous man, and he won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way. We will, Rhett said. And thank you, Silas, for everything. As they were preparing to leave, Sarah, the saloon owner, approached them. She had been watching them, observing their movements, her eyes filled with a knowing wisdom. I know what you're doing, she said, her voice low and urgent. And I want to help. Madeline and Rhett were surprised. They hadn't confided in Sarah, hadn't revealed their plans to anyone. How did you know? Madeline asked. Sarah smiled. Asad, knowing smile. I've lived in Haven a long time, she said. I see things. I hear things. And I know when people are in trouble. She handed Rhett a small, leather pouch. This is for you, she said. It belonged to my husband. He was a good man, a man who believed in justice. He would have wanted you to have it. Rhett opened the pouch. Inside, he found a gold nugget, a sizable chunk of the precious metal. This is too much, Rhett said. I can't accept this. Take it, Sarah insisted. You'll need it. And use it wisely. Rhett and Madeline thanked Sarah, their hearts filled with gratitude. They knew that her help could make the difference between success and failure, between life and death. They rode out of Haven under the cover of darkness, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft sand. They rode in silence, their minds focused on the journey ahead, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They rode throughout the night, stopping only briefly to rest their horses. As dawn approached, they reached the outskirts of Haven, the town disappearing behind them in the morning mist. Suddenly, they heard the sound of approaching riders. They looked back, their hearts sinking. It was Brody and a posse of his men, their faces grim and determined. They must have discovered we were gone, Madeline said, her voice filled with alarm. Rhett spurred his horse forward, his face set in a determined grimace.
"We can't let them catch us," he said. "Not now."
They galloped across the open plains, the wind whipping through their hair, the pounding of hooves echoing in their ears. Brody and his men were gaining on them, their shouts and curses growing louder. Rhett led them towards a rocky canyon, a treacherous landscape that offered some cover, some advantage. He knew that if they could reach the canyon, they might have a chance to escape. The chase was on, a desperate race against time, a reckoning under the blazing sun. The pursuers and the pursued, the corrupt lawmen and the unlikely heroes, all locked in a deadly struggle for justice, for survival, for the future. The outcome was uncertain, the stakes higher than ever before. Chapter 15. The Fragile Bonds of New Beginnings. The chase through the canyon was a harrowing ordeal. The narrow passages, steep cliffs, and loose rocks made the terrain treacherous, testing the skills and endurance of both riders and horses. Rhett, familiar with the area, used his knowledge to his advantage, leading Brody and his posse on a winding, confusing path. Madeline clung to Bess, her body aching, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never experienced anything like this before, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, the fear mixing with a strange sense of exhilaration. Rhett, riding ahead, constantly looked back, making sure Madeline was safe, guiding her through the most difficult passages. He was a skilled horseman, a seasoned fighter, but he was also aware of the dangers, of the risks they were taking. They managed to elude Brody and his men for a while, using the canyon's twists and turns to their advantage. But the posse was relentless, their pursuit fueled by Brody's determination to silence them, to protect his corrupt empire. As they neared the end of the canyon, Rhett spotted a narrow crevice, a hidden passage that led to higher ground. He knew that if they could reach it, they might be able to escape, to lose their pursuers in the vast, open landscape beyond. "Follow me," he shouted to Madeline, his voice strained. "And be careful." He led them through the crevice, the horses scrambling over the rocks, their hooves slipping on the uneven surface. They emerged from the passage onto a high plateau, overlooking the canyon below. They had made it. They had escaped the immediate danger, but they were still far from safe. Brody and his men would not give up easily, and they were still a long way from Silver Gulch. They stopped to rest their horses, allowing them to catch their breath. They drank water from their canteens, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. "We can't stay here," Rhett said. "They'll find us eventually." "Where do we go?" Madeline asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Rhett pointed towards a distant mountain range. "There's a pass through those mountains," he said. "It's a longer route, but it's safer.
Fewer people travel that way."
They set off again, their pace slower now, conserving their horses' energy. They rode in silence, their thoughts consumed by the challenges ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they found a small, sheltered cave, a place to rest for the night. They built a small fire, its warmth a welcome comfort in the cool evening air. They shared their meager provisions, their conversation subdued. They were both exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained. Rhett looked at Madeline, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "You were amazing back there," he said. "You were brave, resourceful. You saved my life again." Madeline smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We saved each other," she said. "We're a team now." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. There was a silent understanding between them, a bond forged by their shared experiences, their mutual struggles. They had faced death together, and they had survived. They had learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to protect each other. As they lay down to sleep, the fire casting flickering shadows on the cave walls, Madeline felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope. She had come to this wild, unforgiving land seeking refuge, seeking a new beginning. And she had found it, not in the way she had expected, but in the most unexpected of places, in the most unexpected of companions. The fragile bonds of their new beginnings were being tested, stretched to their limits. But they were holding, strengthened by adversity, by shared danger, by the growing affection that blossomed between them, unspoken but undeniable. The night was dark, but the embers of hope glowed brightly, promising a dawn, however uncertain. Chapter 16. Where Honor Meets Desperation. The journey through the mountain pass was arduous, a test of endurance and willpower. The terrain was steep and rocky, the air thin and cold, the path often obscured by snow and ice. Rhett and Madeline pushed on, their determination fueled by their desire to reach Silver Gulch, to deliver the evidence that would expose Brody's corruption. They faced numerous challenges along the way. They encountered treacherous weather, including a blinding snowstorm that forced them to seek shelter in a small, abandoned cabin. They navigated treacherous cliffs and narrow ledges, their horses struggling to maintain their footing. They rationed their supplies carefully, aware that they were running low on food and water. Throughout it all, they supported each other, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They learned to rely on each other's strengths, to compensate for each other's weaknesses. One evening, as they were camped near a small, frozen stream, Rhett spoke of his past, of his life before he met Sarah. He told Madeline about his childhood, his family, his early years as a lawman. "I used to believe in the law," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I used to think that justice was always served, that the good guys always won. But I was wrong. The world is a complicated place, Madeline. And sometimes the lines between right and wrong become blurred." Madeline listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his disillusionment, his loss of faith. She had experienced her own share of disappointment, of betrayal. "But there are still good people in the world, Rhett," she said. "People who believe in justice, who are willing to fight for what's right." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "You're one of them, Madeline," he said. "You've shown me that." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And you, Rhett," she said. "You're a good man, despite everything you've been through." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise, the sound of approaching horses. They quickly extinguished their fire, their senses on high alert. Rhett drew his gun, his body tensing. "It could be Brody," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Or Thornton's men." They waited in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of the horses grew closer, closer. Suddenly, a group of riders appeared, their faces obscured by the darkness. Rhett raised his gun, ready to fire. But then, he recognized one of the riders, a familiar figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was Sarah, the saloon owner from Haven. "Sarah?" Rhett said, his voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Sarah dismounted, her face grim. "I came to warn you," she said. "Brody knows about Judge Thompson. He sent men ahead to intercept you, to ambush you before you reach Silver Gulch." Madeline and Rhett exchanged a worried look. They were trapped, caught between Brody's forces behind them and an ambush ahead. "We have to find another way," Madeline said. "We can't go to Silver Gulch." Sarah nodded. "There is another way," she said. "A secret passage, known only to a few. It's dangerous, but it's your only chance." She explained the route, a treacherous path that wound through the mountains, avoiding the main roads and trails. It was a long and difficult journey, but it offered them a glimmer of hope. Honor and desperation collided. Rhett, once a lawman, was now relying on the knowledge of a saloon owner and breaking every law he once swore to uphold. Madeline, once a woman of privilege, was now risking her life alongside an outlaw. The lines had blurred, the roles reversed, and their survival depended on their willingness to trust each other, to embrace the unconventional, to forge their own path. They set out once more, desperation driving them forward, honor guiding their steps, their destination uncertain, their future hanging in the balance. Chapter 17. The Ghosts of Yesterday's Choices. Sarah's secret passage proved to be even more treacherous than she had warned. It was a narrow, winding trail that clung to the sides of steep cliffs, often obscured by fallen rocks and overgrown vegetation. The horses struggled to maintain their footing, their hooves slipping on the loose gravel. The air was thin and cold, the wind whipping through the narrow canyons, carrying with it the whispers of the mountains. Madeline and Rhett pressed on, their bodies aching, their minds numb with exhaustion. They were driven by a sense of urgency, by the knowledge that Brody's men were closing in, by the hope that they could still reach safety, that they could still expose the corruption that had taken root in Haven. Sarah rode with them, her presence a source of strength and guidance. She knew the passage intimately, having learned it from her late husband, a man who had explored these mountains for years. She pointed out the dangers, the hidden pitfalls, the safest routes. As they journeyed deeper into the mountains, they began to encounter remnants of the past, echoes of the lives that had once thrived in this remote and unforgiving land. They passed abandoned mines, crumbling cabins, and weathered grave markers, silent witnesses to the dreams and tragedies of those who had come before them. One evening, as they were camped near a crumbling stone structure, Sarah told them the story of the passage, of its origins, of the people who had used it throughout the years. This passage was used by Native Americans for centuries, she said. It was their secret route, their way to escape their enemies, to find refuge in the mountains. Later, it was used by outlaws, by prospectors, by anyone who needed to disappear, to avoid the law, to start anew. Madeline and Rhett listened, their imaginations captivated by Sarah's words. They felt a connection to the past, to the ghosts of those who had walked this same path, who had faced similar challenges, who had sought solace in the solitude of the mountains. As Sarah spoke, Rhett noticed a familiar symbol carved into one of the stones of the crumbling structure. It was a small, intricate design, a symbol he had seen before, somewhere he suddenly remembered. It was the same symbol that was carved on the wooden box, the box that contained the evidence of Brody's corruption. Sarah, he said, his voice filled with excitement. Do you know what the symbol means? Sarah examined the symbol, her eyes widening in recognition.
Yes, she said.
It's the mark of the Shadow Riders, a group of outlaws who operated in these mountains many years ago. They were known for their daring raids, their Robin Hood-like tactics, their commitment to justice. Rhett was stunned. He had always thought the name Shadow Rider was just a nickname, a label given to him by others. He had never known that it had a deeper meaning, a historical significance. My husband told me the stories. Sarah continued. The Shadow Riders protected the weak, the ones the law didn't reach. And that symbol it's on the box because your Sarah was a descendant of their leader. The ghosts of yesterday's choices were swirling around them, revealing hidden connections, unexpected truths. Rhett's past, Sarah's past, the history of the land itself all intertwined, all converging on this perilous journey. The weight of legacy, of inherited purpose, settled upon them, a heavy burden, but also a source of strength, a reminder that they were not alone, that they were part of a larger story, a continuing struggle for justice. The past was not dead, it was alive, whispering its secrets, guiding their steps, shaping their destiny. Chapter 18. A Promise Forged in Fire. The revelation that Rhett was connected to the legendary Shadow Riders through Sarah's lineage added a new layer of complexity to their journey. It was no longer just about escaping Brody and exposing his corruption, it was about carrying on a legacy of justice, of fighting for the oppressed, of upholding the ideals of a group of outlaws who had operated in these very mountains generations ago. The final leg of their journey, through Sarah's secret passage, was fraught with peril. They encountered a rock slide, narrowly avoiding being buried alive. They were forced to cross a raging river, the icy water threatening to sweep them away. They navigated treacherous cliffs, their horses struggling to maintain their footing on the narrow ledges. Throughout it all, Rhett and Madeline supported each other, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced death together, and they had survived. They had learned to trust each other implicitly, to rely on each other's strengths, to protect each other at all costs. As they neared the end of the passage, Sarah pointed towards a distant valley, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. There it is, she said. The end of the passage. Beyond those hills lies Silver Gulch. Relief washed over Madeline and Rhett, a wave of exhaustion mixed with a surge of hope. They had made it. They had overcome the obstacles, the dangers, the treacherous terrain. They were almost there, but as they descended from the mountains, they encountered one final challenge. A group of riders blocked their path, their faces grim and determined. It was Brody, accompanied by Thornton and several of his hired guns. They had anticipated their arrival, had laid a trap for them. Well, Brody sneered. Looks like you took the scenic route, Callahan. But it ends here. Rhett drew his gun, his body tensing. It doesn't have to end this way, Brody, he said. You can still walk away. Brody laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You're a fool, Callahan, he said. You think you can defeat me? You think you can expose me? You're wrong. I have friends in high places. I control this territory. Thornton stepped forward, his eyes filled with hatred. Give me the gold, Callahan, he said. And I might let you live. The gold belongs to the miners, Rhett replied, his voice unwavering. And you'll never get it. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with unspoken threats. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. Suddenly, Sarah spurred her horse forward, riding towards Brody. Stop this, Brody, she shouted. This isn't right. You're a lawman, sworn to uphold justice. Brody hesitated, his eyes flickering between Sarah and Rhett. He seemed to be struggling with his conscience, with the weight of his past actions. But Thornton, seeing his opportunity, drew his gun and fired. The bullet struck Sarah, knocking her from her horse. Rhett roared in anger, firing his own gun at Thornton. The two men exchanged shots, their bullets whizzing through the air. Madeline, horrified by Sarah's fall, ran to her side. Sarah was lying on the ground, her body bleeding, her breathing shallow. Sarah, Madeline cried, her voice filled with anguish.
Hold on.
Sarah looked at Madeline, her eyes filled with pain but also with a strange sense of peace. It's all right, child, she whispered. I've lived a long life, and I'm glad I could help. She reached out and took Madeline's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. You and Rhett, you're good people, she said. You have to keep fighting. For justice. For what's right. Her hand went limp, her eyes closing. Sarah was gone. Rhett, seeing Sarah fall, felt a surge of grief and rage. He fought with renewed ferocity, his shots accurate and deadly. He wounded Thornton, forcing him to retreat. He shot down 2 of Brody's men, scattering the rest. Brody, seeing his forces decimated, his plans crumbling, finally surrendered. He dropped his gun, his face filled with defeat and despair. The battle was over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sobs of Madeline, mourning the loss of Sarah. They buried Sarah near a grove, a simple wooden marker over the fresh earth. Rhett said the words his wife had once written in her diary, a passage about hope in the face of death. And then, looking at Madeline, he spoke words that came unbidden, a promise forged in the fire of their shared ordeal. I'll never leave you, he said, the words rough, but sure. The fire of their battle had forged something new, something enduring. It was more than survival now. It was a commitment, a beginning, born out of loss and fueled by a shared hope for a future they would face together. Chapter 19. The Long Road to Redemption. The journey to Silver Gulch, after the devastating loss of Sarah and the final confrontation with Brody and Thornton, was somber and reflective. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the sacrifice Sarah had made. Rhett and Madeline rode in silence, their thoughts consumed by grief and the weight of their responsibilities. They arrived in Silver Gulch, a bustling town larger and more prosperous than Haven. They immediately sought out Judge Thompson, a stern but fair-looking man with a reputation for integrity. They presented him with the documents they had recovered from the wooden box, the evidence of Brody's and Thornton's corruption. Judge Thompson examined the documents carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He listened intently to Rhett's and Madeline's account of the events, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. This is a serious matter, he said, his voice grave. If these allegations are true, then Brody and Thornton have committed grave crimes, betraying the trust of the people they were sworn to protect. He assured them that he would launch a full investigation, that he would bring the perpetrators to justice. He issued warrants for Brody's and Thornton's arrest, and he sent a telegram to the territorial governor, requesting assistance in apprehending them. Rhett and Madeline felt a sense of relief, a sense of accomplishment. They had done what they had set out to do. They had exposed the corruption. They had delivered the evidence to the proper authorities. But their journey was far from over. They spent several days in Silver Gulch, cooperating with Judge Thompson's investigation, providing testimony, answering questions. They were treated with respect and gratitude, their courage and determination recognized by the townspeople. During this time, Rhett and Madeline had the opportunity to reflect on their experiences, to process their emotions, to begin to heal from the wounds they had suffered. They talked about Sarah, about her bravery, her sacrifice, her unwavering belief in justice. They also talked about their future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. They had formed a deep bond, a connection forged in the crucible of adversity. They had learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to love each other. Rhett, haunted by the ghosts of his past, by the loss of his wife, by the violence he had witnessed and participated in, began to see a path towards redemption. He realized that he could use his skills, his experience, his knowledge to help others, to make a positive difference in the world. Madeline, having escaped a life of lies and betrayal, having found her own strength and resilience, began to envision a future filled with hope and purpose. She had discovered a courage she never knew she possessed, a willingness to fight for what she believed in. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their hotel, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Rhett turned to Madeline, his eyes filled with emotion. "Madeline," he said, his voice hesitant, I know we've been through a lot together, and I know it's not been easy, but I've come to care for you deeply, more than I ever thought possible." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She had felt the same way, but she had been afraid to admit it, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of risking another heartbreak. "Rhett," she said, her voice trembling, I care for you too. More than I can say." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and warm. "I know I can't replace Sarah," he said, "but I want to build a new life.
With you. If you'll have me."
Tears welled up in Madeline's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of hope. "I'll have you, Rhett," she said. "I'll have you." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The long road to redemption had led them to this moment, to this promise of a new beginning, a future filled with love, with hope, with the possibility of happiness. The wounds of the past would always be there, a reminder of the pain they had endured, but they would no longer define them. They would be scars, symbols of their resilience, their strength, their ability to overcome adversity. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. News arrived in Silver Gulch that Brody had been captured, but Thornton, aided by some remaining loyalists, had escaped and was heading back towards Haven, presumably to retrieve the hidden gold and flee the territory. Judge Thompson, concerned that Thornton might still pose a threat, urged Rhett and Madeline to remain in Silver Gulch under his protection. But Rhett knew he couldn't stay. He had a responsibility to the miners of Haven, to the memory of Sarah, to the legacy of the Shadow Riders. He had to ensure that Thornton was brought to justice, that the gold was returned to its rightful owners. Madeline, despite her fears, understood Rhett's decision. She knew that he couldn't rest until Thornton was stopped, until the threat to Haven was eliminated. And she knew that she couldn't let him face this danger alone. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Rhett tried to dissuade her, arguing that it was too dangerous, that she should stay in Silver Gulch, where she would be safe. But Madeline was adamant. "We're a team, Rhett," she said. "We face this together, just like we always have." Rhett knew he couldn't argue with her. He admired her courage, her determination, her unwavering loyalty. And he knew that he needed her by his side, that her strength and resilience would be invaluable in the challenges ahead. They prepared for their return to Haven, gathering supplies, checking their weapons, saying their goodbyes to Judge Thompson and the townspeople who had shown them kindness and support. They rode out of Silver Gulch, their faces set in grim determination, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They knew that they were heading into a dangerous confrontation, that their lives were on the line. But they were prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. As they neared Haven, they saw smoke rising in the distance, a dark cloud looming over the town. They spurred their horses forward, their hearts pounding in their chests. They arrived in Haven to find chaos and destruction. Thornton and his men had attacked the town, seeking revenge, determined to retrieve the gold at any cost. Buildings were burning, the streets were littered with debris, and the townsfolk were huddled in fear, their homes and livelihoods threatened. Rhett and Madeline immediately joined the fight, rallying the remaining townsfolk, organizing a defense. Rhett, drawing on his experience as a lawman and a gunfighter, led the charge, his shots accurate and deadly. Madeline, despite her lack of combat experience, fought bravely alongside him, her determination fueled by her love for Rhett and her commitment to justice. The battle raged through the streets of Haven, a fierce and desperate struggle between the forces of good and evil. Rhett and Madeline fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They finally cornered Thornton in the town square, the remnants of his gang defeated or scattered. Thornton, his face contorted with rage and desperation, raised his gun, aiming at Rhett. But before he could fire, Madeline stepped in front of Rhett, shielding him with her body. The bullet struck her in the shoulder, knocking her to the ground. "Madeline!" Rhett cried, his voice filled with anguish. He fired his own gun, hitting Thornton squarely in the chest. Thornton crumpled to the ground, dead. Rhett rushed to Madeline's side, his heart pounding in his chest. She was lying on the ground, her face pale, her shoulder bleeding. "I'm all right," she said, her voice weak but reassuring. "It's just a flesh wound." Rhett, his hands trembling, examined her wound. It was serious, but not life-threatening. He quickly bandaged it, his relief overwhelming. The remaining townsfolk, having witnessed Madeline's bravery and Rhett's devotion, cheered their victory. Thornton was dead, his reign of terror over. Haven was safe, its future secured. The final confrontation had taken place, not just between Rhett and Thornton, but within the hearts of Rhett and Madeline. Their love, their commitment, their courage had been tested to the limit, and they had emerged victorious. The horizons of Haven, once clouded by fear and uncertainty, now stretched out before them, filled with the promise of a new beginning, a future built on justice, on love, on the enduring strength of their bond. Epilogue. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding, both for Madeline and for the town of Haven. Madeline's gunshot wound, though painful, healed cleanly, thanks to the prompt care of the town's doctor. The physical scars would remain, a permanent reminder of the battle they had fought, but the emotional wounds were slowly mending, soothed by the love and support of Rhett and the grateful community. Haven, too, began to recover. The burned buildings were rebuilt, the streets cleared of debris, the spirit of the town renewed. The miners, their stolen gold recovered and returned, celebrated their newfound security, their voices raised in songs of gratitude and hope. Rhett, fulfilling a promise he had made to himself and to Madeline, used his share of the recovered gold to establish a fund for the miners' families, ensuring their well-being and providing for their future. He also worked with Judge Thompson to establish a new, more just legal system in Haven, ensuring that the corruption that had taken root under Brody's rule would never return. Madeline, finding a new purpose in her life, became actively involved in the community, helping to establish a school for the children of Haven, teaching them to read and write, sharing with them the knowledge and skills she had acquired in her former life. Sheriff Brody was brought to justice, sentenced to a long prison term for his crimes. Thornton's remaining accomplices were also apprehended and punished, their reign of terror brought to a definitive end. Rhett and Madeline, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced, decided to make Haven their permanent home. They purchased a small ranch just outside of town, a place where they could build a new life together, a place where they could raise a family, a place where they could find peace and happiness. They were married in the town square, the entire community gathering to celebrate their union. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with sincerity and deep emotion. They exchanged rings, symbols of their enduring love, their commitment to each other, their promise of a shared future. As the sun set on their wedding day, casting a golden glow over the town of Haven, Rhett and Madeline stood on the porch of their new ranch house, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with gratitude and hope. They looked out at the vast expanse of the western landscape, the mountains silhouetted against the twilight sky, the stars beginning to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. They had come to this wild, unforgiving land seeking refuge, seeking a new beginning. And they had found it, not in the way they had expected, but in a way that was far more profound, far more meaningful. They had found love, they had found purpose, they had found a home. The ghosts of the past still lingered, the memories of pain and loss, of betrayal and violence, but they no longer held the power to define them. They were scars, reminders of the battles they had fought, the challenges they had overcome, the strength they had found within themselves and in each other. The future remained uncertain, as it always does, but they were no longer afraid. They had each other, they had their love, they had their commitment to justice, and they had the unwavering support of the community they had come to call their own. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together, their hearts filled with hope, their spirits strong, their love a beacon guiding them towards a brighter tomorrow. The long journey was over, but a new one was just beginning, a journey of love, of healing, of building a life together, a life worthy of the sacrifices they had made, a life worthy of the promise forged in fire. The frontier had tested them, broken them, and ultimately made them whole. The end.